Hello there and welcome to this Dublin City Libraries Readers' Morning at the Dublin Book Festival. I'm with Alice Lyons and Elaine Feeney. They've both published 3 collections of poetry, but today we're here to celebrate and talk about their first novels. Elaine Feeney's As You Were and Oona by Alice Lyons. Elaine Feeney was born in Athenry, Alice Lyons in New Jersey, but both live now in the west of Ireland. And though Oona begins in America, the setting for much of the novel is in the west of Ireland. These novels are very alive in their thinking. They contain unforgettable characters, and the reader is also offered very sharp insights into life in 21st century Ireland. As You Were takes place over 1 week in the ward of an underfunded Galway hospital. The other characters in the hospital ward and backstories allow Feeney explore themes such as history, national identity, gender, religion, state institutions. Oona begins in New Jersey. It covers decades. It explores art, the making of art, the appreciation of art, and also important issues like septic tanks and dodgy planning. Very welcome, both of you. And I'd like to begin with a sentence that stopped me in my tracks from Oona by Alice Lyons, but it's a sentence that really resonates in my reading of both of your novels. The sentence goes, "Simple interface with a human being, the medicine in it." And I think that both of you explore the plain people of Ireland, decent people, and you both realise that there is a goodness in unexpected places.
Yes. Yes, and it's funny coming here today, I just said before we started this whole event that it's so nice to be among people. And there is medicine in it. And I think especially now during COVID times, this strange time that we're in, I think you know, for Oona, it was medicine to leave the suburbs of New Jersey that were very much about acquiring, moving up the ladder, very, very much focused on capitalism and success. And then moving to rural Ireland, she discovers the art of conversation, that she's forgotten how to lead.
You say it invaded your character. Ireland invaded once you arrived. And there's a wonderful section in the book where you describe an Irish funeral, and it is absolutely spot on. Now, your characters, all human life is there. In the character of Sinead Hines, who is, I mean, I loved how you framed the novel. A magpie at the beginning, one for sorrow. In the closing pages, 7 magpies for a story that never to be told. And yet this story is shared with the reader. We know something that Sinead Hines knows and no other character does, which is a very deliberate ploy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think to go back to, you know, the human interaction, I think we're living in a very much an echo chamber online and so on, and I really wanted to write a novel that actually reflected people how I knew them, not online or not in this screen, this black mirror sort of sense. You're right, she gets her diagnosis, Sinead gets her diagnosis on the first page, so I'm not breaking any secrets there, even though there are many secrets in the novel, and she just tells a magpie, and by the end of it, correct, the 7 magpies, is a story never to be told, even though on those 7 days in the hospital, all of the stories spill out to strangers, which I always find that quite fascinating, how you can tell your story to a person on a train, or you could tell it to someone on a bus, but you couldn't tell maybe sometimes your nearest and dearest, someone that you really love, and I think that's protection. You know.
I think you're both being poets stood you in very good stead, because both novels have an intensity and an energy, and typographically on the page sometimes you can see something, well, Wordsworth said there's no difference between good prose and good poetry. And I think that you do, as it were, give us very wonderful poetic writing as well as a writing that would be considered a more conventional kind of writing. How aware of that were you, Alice?
Yeah, very aware. I mean, my mentor and friend Kieran Carson always said about writing prose that he couldn't write a sentence until he could hear the music in the sentence as he could in a line of verse. And I think a similar kind of thing went for me, that in the writing of a narrative, although I wouldn't say that my book is a traditional kind of narrative. I think it's a hybrid of a couple of different approaches, but still there was a sense that somehow the language had to really be engaged. And I think that's one of the reasons that I decided in the end to exclude the letter O.
Yes, I mean, the elephant in the room is the absence,
Yeah.
the absent O.
I'll bring it up.
But both of your works, they are narratives of loss, really. Mm-hmm. And what interested me most, as a male reader perhaps of your novel, was the imperfect marriage between Sinead and Alex. I thought there was something so convincing and so sad about that relationship. I thought it was powerful. I mean, I loved all the other characters. Margaret Rose Sherlock is unforgettable. Jane Lohan in her dementia and in her lucid moments. And through those you can explore issues that are really pertinent to 21st century Ireland. But I thought, how important was that marriage for you when you began writing the novel?
Well, it was everything, I suppose, at the start. I mean, I had started it in some sort of I'm going to confess now to an autofiction, 12 chapters, after being very ill myself and having a really, really touch and go scenario. And I suppose I just wanted to, I wanted to get that out of my system. And I always say that I parted company with Sinead by chapter 1, but I still did want to really investigate, modern marriage, the busy life, how we can disconnect. And again, going back into that way, how we seem to sort of want to protect each other. And we don't want to tell people our deepest kind of thoughts. And I was worried that Sinead, that disconnect from the marriage might, that readers mightn't really take to it. Or I don't know, I felt she might be heavily judged for the way she behaves in the marriage, When my sister was reading a draft, she said, I just wanted her to tell Alex, just tell him, talk to him. And they slide past each other, don't they? They come slant constantly.
That's right. And when Alex is told, he talks about things like the holiday in the fridge. He's a typical male response in many ways. But I thought that sentence of yours, Elaine, but we had things in common, and we promised when we were old we'd search each other for them. That's heartbreaking, because the way they meet on the banks of the river and so on, and the Swan, all of that is filled with a kind of a promise, and then the mundane takes over.
Absolutely.
And your character, Sinead Hines, not the most attractive of protagonists. I mean, she's sipping martinis on a Friday night and Alex is watching the kid play the football match. Come on now, Elaine.
Good for her, I'd say that, And I suppose that's her disconnect, and there is a disconnection. But let's, if we turn the tables there and Alex is having a pint on a Friday night and she's bringing her daughter to ballet, it might be less noticed, I think. And I suppose in a way I wanted to reflect the women that I know, my friends.
Okay. You've one of your epigraphs, Alice, is from Tarkovsky, about things falling apart and hopeless in terms of getting something right. But I think it works brilliantly in terms of structure. But how difficult was it for you to knit together the cash-nut culture in New Jersey, getting your ears pierced at 12, the rebellious youth, dabbling in drugs, the mother in the novel dying, cancer overshadows both books, in fact, and then your kind of interest in art. I mean, how did you, at the beginning, had you a sense that was the trajectory of the novel?
I didn't have a sense of the trajectory. I think I often work by fumbling forward. But I think the overriding method was plaiting. A few things that were very important, and you've listed them, but that writing is plaiting and braiding things together. And I think I trusted in that process, and that's why I chose that epigraph from Tarkovsky about mirror, because he says it doesn't make any sense, this film that he's putting together, nobody understands what it's about, and yet it becomes a beautiful thing, but the creator himself or herself is unaware of the way things come together. We only see fragments, But I wanted to write about that in a way that we give up hope. There's so much about art making and writing that is about despair, that it can't be done. and yet it happens, and it does. There's an imperative to do it, and it does come together very often. Often it doesn't, but
it does here.
Well,
and in your case, when you set out to begin writing, was it as it is now? Did you?
No, it was like, it took me 4 years, and it was like, it was an unwieldy thing. It was just massive. And what happened was, after maybe that part of autofiction, these characters sort of came along in an almost Dickens sense, and it sounds overly romantic to say it, but I couldn't conceive of a hospital ward without these matriarchs that we've all met on hospital wards, you know.
Then you have Molly and Michael as well.
Yeah, well, they're kind of modern Ireland, aren't they?
They are indeed.
Yeah.
But has anyone said to you, listen, you would get men and women in the same ward?
Well, no, because I have been on a mixed gender ward myself. It does
Modern
exist.
Galway.
It does exist. So, you know, a modern Galway, well, this is a fictional hospital in some part of Galway. So, no, and I was intrigued by that, actually.
And in your poetry, you've written about Letterfrack, the Tuam Babies, you've revisited Kathleen Ní Ghríofa and The Rising. Do you see this as a political novel?
Well, I didn't mean it to be political, and I suppose I was writing the novel to get away from that political angst in my poetry. I really did want to break from it because of the I and the political, and I suppose I started in the slam scene, very different sort of scene, and I did want to bring that into the novel. You know, it mightn't be everybody's beginning in poetry, but you know, I'm very proud of that. So when I set about it, but when you have 3 women of these different ages, intergenerational women, you couldn't be with an 8-year-old woman without hearing some story. You know, lost love or mother and baby home, or some horror story about, you know, her past or the past of someone she knows very deeply. And that's the Jane and Anne story, you know, that backstory. And I wonder, you know, and I think I wrote it at that time just before repeal, when women had so much skin in the game. They were revealing so much of themselves to you know, for basic human rights, the way I see it. So I wanted women of all generations to have some sort of a say, and I thought, where better to talk than at, you know, when you're shoved in the corner of a hospital ward and your back is to the wall, and to have those conversations. So I didn't mean it to be as political as it has been, I suppose, received. I'm always surprised by that. I'm always surprised when I'm considered a political writer, which my mum thinks is very naive of me.
You have a political element in your novel as well, the cute hoorism of the west of Ireland, even though you have a fondness for it, and the people, you know, how they organise themselves within a small community. Now, this is a novel, but it is autofiction, without a doubt, I would say, no?
Well, yeah, I mean, as much as something like, I mean, I just finished reading McGahern's The Dark.
Okay.
Do you know, so I don't think autofiction is a new thing, but I do think, yes, there are alignments for sure. There are alignments. Yes.
And was it always in the first person?
No, it wasn't. It was in the third person. There was a time when this book was a more academic essay on sociolinguistics, on the way people speak in rural Ireland and in New Jersey. And like you, Elaine, it took 4 years for me too. So there was a process of finding the point of view, and eventually, after maybe a year and a half, the point of view became first person, and I became not I, and there was always that kind of shimmering shift, I think, between the I and the not I.
Right.
Between I and Oona.
Well, the book's a thing, so let's hear an extract from it. So, Elaine, would you read a short piece?
Of course, yeah.
Perhaps contextualise it for us?
So, Jane Lohan, who's in her 80s, and Margaret Rose Sherlock decide that it would be very prudent if they looked for a cure to save a young man on the ward called Shane, who's had a motorbike accident and also some heart surgery. But Shane's time is running out, so they decide a cure will save him. So, I'll pick it up here. Jane woke Margaret Rose, and they searched deep in their nightstands, tugging out extra religious paraphernalia for a cure to save Shane. Margaret Rose was busy. This was the best way to be after Nikita's exit. Jane was busy, as this was her only way. The search for this cure went in a hierarchy of inanimate but precious objects, with head nods, and everything was displayed on the striped, shiny mattress of Jane's bed like an eccentric May altar. The 2 women hummed and hawed as they pawed over beads and cards and plastic statues of saints full up with water. If they could only get in the mitten of Padre Pio, or a drop of blessed oil of St. Therese of Lisieux, or even a lock of St. Francis of Assisi's hair. even a hair from one of his pets. But they were unsure that Assisi had left behind any cure at all. But he was a lovely man, yes, lovely man, loved animals. Margaret Rose put her daughter Michaela on the Nokia to someone in Navan who had the mitten of Padre Pio. She'd been given it for her son who had developed itchy and incurable warts, and it would be sent down on the next bus with a trusted bus driver and hopefully make it on time for Shane. If not by this evening, with any luck, it would arrive by the morning. Jane Lohan blessed herself backwards, which, according to Margaret Rose, was motioning in the devil, and Jane stared at her blankly, then began blessing Margaret Rose instead, misunderstanding the instructions. So we all blessed ourselves 10 times at Margaret Rose's request, for fear we'd brought the work of the devil onto the ward. And she encouraged a proper blessing. Michaela instructed that if we do it like soccer players, and she demonstrated to her mother and Jane, they copied her, blessed themselves, kissed their thumbs, then lifted their kissed hands to the ceiling, thumbs clutched, and finally walloping their hearts. With the help of good God and of many of his archangels, especially the favourite one, Michael, or so they thought, and then they were unsure as to which archangel was the favourite, the glove would get her safely off the Navan bus. The taller nurse leaned in, opened Shane's dry mouth, and rubbed a giant cotton bud across his cracking lips, dipping it into his mouth a little, while holding his head in the crook of her arm. His face reminded me of a dying cow down after birthing a difficult calf.
Well done, well done. The Pishog and that kind of naive or simple religious belief permeates the book. But Sinead Hines is an atheist.
Yes.
And yet there's a lovely touching moment towards the end when Margaret Rose gives her a mass card. So the novel isn't rejecting. I mean, obviously there's an anger there at the Magdalen laundries, at the bishop with his cigar and champagne, and those kind of corrupt aspects of the injustice of the church. But there's also a warm affection for good old traditional Ireland, no?
Well, absolutely. I suppose if you look at it like the Roman Catholic Church was the system by which oppression was meted out in Ireland. You know, this changes country to country, and there's always oppressors, there's always oppression, there's always systems of hierarchy. And I think people culturally, on a person-to-person level, when you meet a person on that level and they believe in this, and these women really believe that if the mitten of Padre Pio comes in and they rub it off Shane, that it will in some way ease him. And I suppose they feel so you know, unable to do anything else for him, that they really feel that this is a gift to him. And I suppose Sinead accepts that with all these, the holy water and the mass cards and so on, that, you know, she's kind to them in their belief system. She doesn't share it in any way, and it doesn't change her. I mean, Margaret Rose also gives her an naggin of vodka. So, I mean, she accepts both the card and the vodka. But, you know, I think there's a respect there for their culture at a very human level, and I think you can't take that away from people. I think that's very important in their end moments, and I mean the book is very much about that.
Oona, living in Coot Hall in the west of Ireland, is obviously an odd one out in many ways, but she integrates, but she's also a wonderfully interesting maker of art. And I love those passages where you describe the process of pigmentation or pigment and the making of the artwork, and your exegesis of paintings. The one towards the end is superb. But your piece that you're going to read, Alice, brings us back to the plain people of Ireland.
It does, yes. So Oona is in her village in Leitrim, and she is learning about history. And one of the ways that she does is by looking at the collection of cars that the mail carrier, the postie, uses over the years to deliver the post around the county. The lane behind the mail delivering lady's place was where picking blackberries was best. Being tucked away, there wasn't any street dust, weed killer, and mutts with their dirty lifted back legs. The berries were clean, darkest, and sweetest there, glistening, ripe fly eyes in the hedges that we ate, sun warm. My time in the village is measured in the ditched cars that had been her mail delivery vehicles. The farther back in the lane, the farther back car time, which is time, went. Blackberry picking became a walk in a village archive. The blue VW Passat was still intact, parked up near the back wall. Then the silver Astra, missing a windshield and back tires. Then the white Renault van, nearly unremembered, glass entirely absent, carrying trumpet vine, bindweed, and brambles as passengers. Finally, a twisted, rusted thing missing paint, wheels and axles. Just a chassis, the make indiscernible. That was way, way back in the day.
Well done. The absence of O gives it an extraordinary strangeness and yet a beauty. And I love that sentence where you spoke of your mother, her mind a star that fell in a blue lake. And again, I'm saying your mother because I kept thinking Alice, Lyons and Oona. We're almost done, but we've questions from far beyond this room. They've come to us via cyberspace. So a question for Elaine Feeney from Sean Patrick Burke via Twitter. My go-to question, he says, what book or movie would someone be surprised to know you're a big fan of?
Well, I think I kind of answered him on Twitter one night, good night, and I said the Bible. Not so much a fan, but it's the only reading material sometimes in a hotel room if you forget a book. So I have actually, I think people are surprised to hear I've read it a few times in hotel rooms.
And Michelle Bishop via email has a question for you, Alice. Looking back now as a published author, is your experience of writing your first novel different from what you expected it to be?
Well, that's a great question. Yes, it is. It's different. Publishing poetry is very different to publishing a novel. It's interesting that we are here as emerging writers, and as you mentioned at the beginning, Elaine and I have both published three books of poetry, and so there's just much more attention. There's a whole circuit in literary festivals and so on. There's just a lot more of a social aspect to it, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful to be in kind of a bigger. I don't want to use the word market, but
you feel compromised. I mean, poetry is the poor relation, but it's the highest art form, I think.
Yeah.
And yet you feel that, you know, poetry is something that you're not allowing yourself to write because this is where the buzz is.
For me, I felt I came to the end of the eye for a little while and I needed an escape from it.
Though you use persona as well in your poetry.
Yeah, I do. And actually, I was finding that was becoming quite problematic. I think maybe 10 years ago it was an easier thing to get away with. I just felt that it was a much more difficult space because you'd have to nearly put a little note at the end of the poem and go, I'm not the first person of this poem, you know. So I thought with a novel you can actually say fiction. So I felt at that stage, but I mean, it's my first love and I'm drawn back to it constantly.
And this leads on to this final question. Denise McBride asks, do you plan to write any more novels? So it's a question for both of you. Is this just novel number one? Are you both working on the next novel?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I just finished mine in lockdown.
Well done.
Yeah. Well, I did, and I sent it to my agent, and it got a kind of a seal of approval, but a few little notes. So, but I've kind of then went. I did it on. I don't know, but yeah, I wrote a second one. Yeah.
And was there much editorial work on these two?
Oh yes, my editor Kate, God bless her, there was a fair bit.
Right, but that must have been an interesting interaction as well, that you send your book out and someone takes the time to...
It's a gift. For me, I just was flabbergasted. I just was so bowled over by this sense that this woman would meet me and have these conversations about the characters that I love so much. Yeah. So, yeah, I was very, very, very grateful.
Well, congratulations on your first novels. They are wonderful both, and we look forward to your second. Elaine Feeney, Alice Lyons, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm now joined by Patrick Freyne and Doireann Ní Ghríofa to mark the publication of their new books. Patrick Freyne's book, a series of 16 interlinked essays, OK, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea, and Doireann Ní Ghríofa's memoir, A Ghost in the Throat, are two very personal, immediate, direct works. Patrick Freyne's book recounts a life crowded with incident, beginning when he, aged 2.5, kicked a little Yorkshire Terrier named Squeaky. Its owner announced at that time, that child will come to no good. What that child became is charted here with humour and honesty, and sometimes with a devastating sadness. Doireann Ní Ghríofa's memoir is a portrait of two marriages more than 200 years apart. It's a detective story, a haunting, a portrait of a woman, wife, mother in 21st century Ireland. It's an exploration of Irish history and the power of one of the greatest love poems ever composed, Cuoine Arty Líre. Above all, as Ní Ghríofa says herself, this is a female text, and the focus is on a young woman whose husband was murdered on the 4th of May, 1773. Very different books, and yet in both books, County Cork plays an important role. You've both been in car accidents, and you both write with a heightened awareness of what is right and wrong, of justice and injustice. But the most striking resemblance, I think, is your honesty, which is unnerving at times. And an artist friend of mine once said that every time she has an exhibition, it is like undressing in public. How difficult was it for you to be so open and honest and to give so much of yourself on the page? Patrick?
It was kind of strange because I have written a lot for the newspaper, but it's usually reporting or it's kind of funny pieces about television, and it's very rarely about myself. And so when I started writing this first, I had this notion that I wanted to write kind of funny essays. But I'd been kind of inspired by work by Emily Pine and Sinead Gleeson, and as soon as I started writing, I started to find myself going deeper. Like it wasn't just, I didn't just stick to the funny stories. I found myself kind of trying to work out how I felt about things and how I thought about things as I wrote. So it never occurred to me as I was doing that I was revealing much about myself. Like when I came to the edit, I kind of realized, okay, I am, and I had to kind of reckon with it at that point. As I was doing it, like sometimes when it was something painful to remember, it was painful to write, but I never saw it as revealing myself because at that point I was just writing it for myself.
But you're writing the paper is wry, self-deprecating, humorous, entertaining, but you tell a lot of stories against yourself. How difficult was that?
Maybe I'm not self-aware enough to know it was against myself. Like I guess I thought a lot about, like, you're right, when you go back and you think about things, you think a lot about the morality of things. And I've realized now that life is difficult because it only seems clear in retrospect. And as you're going through things, I don't judge younger people for silly mistakes they make, because I've realized you kind of half the time you don't know what you're doing. And the reason the book is called, okay, let's do your stupid idea, is sometimes the best things you do are technically mistakes, you know. They're, daft things like your friend saying, you know, we could afford to tour England when you're on the dole and you pull your band's resources together and you somehow tour England half starving in the process. Makes no sense. Your parents would advise against it, but you don't regret it because it's kind of amazing what you learn about yourselves in those circumstances.
Now, Doireann, your preoccupation with Cuoine Arty Líre goes way back to your 11-year-old self in school. And the teacher reprimanded you because she thought you got it wrong. But was that your... Tell us about that.
I suppose I've been very fortunate throughout my life, like a lot of people, to have encountered some very passionate teachers. And I think that can nurture a child in a way that little else can. You meet a teacher who cares about the children in their care and who cares about their subject, and it can change you forever. And so I've met several teachers like that at several different points through primary and in secondary, and they have often used their discretion to bring in things that weren't necessarily part of the official curriculum. And that was one of those scenarios, I think. I mean, it's an unusual choice to bring a poem like Cuoine Arty Líre to a class of primary school children and to adapt your explanation of it to their level of understanding. But I think coming to a work of literature several times over the space of a life, you find yourself changed each time you return to it. And you find the poem changed too. I think it applies to paintings and to songs and to books as well, but particularly in this case with this poem, the girl who came to it at 11 had a very different reaction to the woman who came to it in her 20s. And that was something I was really interested in exploring. Why? Why does it change? Why do we change? And what does that mean?
I mean, the story is extraordinary. She's one of 22 children. She got married at 14, she was widowed at 15, and she eloped with the love of her life when she was 24 and he was 21. I mean, it's the stuff of extraordinary narrative. But what attracted you most to it?
At different points in my life, there were different elements of it that attracted me. For example, as a teenager, it was, I suppose, like a lot of teenagers, it's kind of embarrassing, but the fact of the tragedy and the grand passion of seeing a fella you fancied and running away with him forever. Loved that as a teenager. Loved the fact that when she found Art's body murdered, that she fell to her knees and cupped his blood and drank it. They're the elements that as a teenager draw you into something, in the kind of Romeo and Juliet like tradition, I suppose, of a grand passion and a grand tragedy. Whereas when I returned to it as an adult, I saw something that I'd never noticed the many times that I had come to the poem before, and that was the fact that Eileen Dove was pregnant with her third child when she first composed the Queen and when Art was murdered. And that really moved me very deeply because I was pregnant with my own third child at the time. And I was living in a place that was quite close to Raleigh House and Kilcrea Abbey. The scenes where elements of her story occur. And I felt myself very close to that history and very close to her life. And the more that I returned to the poem, the closer I felt to her voice, until it began to feel as though I was pressing my ear against a wall and I could hear the muffled sounds of another living person at the other side of it, and that she really was that close. And I wanted to know more about her. And, we were speaking about laziness earlier. I'm quite a lazy person. I wished I could have found out more about her life by simply picking up a book in the library. But that book wasn't there.
You found the land and you went to Doireann and went to Kilcrea and all the rest of it. But place is obviously of huge importance, as is it. I mean, the essay on your ancestry in County Cork, that was a powerful, powerful essay, and it has to do with place and the people who were there and the grandmother who was pregnant when she married. I mean, you reveal a huge amount of kind of social history in Patrick Freyne's essays about growing up.
Yeah, because place, I moved a lot when I was a kid, and so if you were to ask me where I was from, I usually have a really complicated answer.
It's Cork, Patrick.
Never
forget it.
That's it. I kind of realised recently that when I say I'm from Cork, I feel like an Irish American saying I'm Irish because I left when I was 6. But it was such an important place to my family and to me, because we moved from Cork, where all of my cousins and aunts and uncles that I loved lived, to the Curragh because my dad was in the army. When I was 6 or 7, and Cork was kind of this mythic place. And then in the context of Cork, Cool Mountain in West Cork, where my mum grew up, and she was rented from, her family moved into the city when she was around 12. And they had that kind of origin myth about Cool Mountain, and I had this origin myth about Cork. And it just made me think about the importance of place, largely because because I moved at that point in my life, I never feel quite rooted. I never feel like I grew up in Kildare, but I don't feel right saying I'm from Kildare either. But I think I am from Cork. Like my uncle, I did a gig in Cork that I mentioned in the book back when I was in my 20s, and I said, I used to be from Cork. And a voice from the audience goes, "You're always from Cork, boy." And it was my uncle, who was really ashamed that I wouldn't just say I'm from Cork. But yeah.
And your own boyhood was lonely. You wanted to be part of things. You wanted to be liked. I mean, I was really struck by the honesty of all of that in your writing.
I think that's why I loved being in a band so much years later, because I moved home and moved school. Like, we moved from Cork. I was in 3 different primary schools. We moved to Newbridge first, then the Curragh Camp, then back to Newbridge. So my friends were always being dislocated from me. By the time I was in my teens starting a band, the band felt like a second family, and bands were really, really important to me. Because I did have, as I was writing it, I started to figure this stuff out, which is the other interesting and new thing for me about kind of personal writing, is you don't know a lot of things, you don't put together a lot of things about yourself till you're asked to explain it, or till you ask yourself to explain it on the page. And when I was putting this stuff together, I could draw all these. I guess that's what psychoanalysis is. You know, you go to psychoanalysis.
Well, you did go to therapy.
I did, yeah. And therapy is kind of like you go in with a broken narrative, and the process of therapy, you fix or put a new narrative that's a bit healthier on top of the events of your life. And to some degree, kind of writing some of the essays in this book were a little bit like that, in that there were things I was unclear about, things I wasn't sure I knew what I felt about, and writing them did feel cathartic to me. And I know there's other writers of essays who hate that idea because they think that the work is the work and it's nothing to do with, you know, therapy. But I can honestly say that this was kind of a bit therapeutic.
You repeat the phrase, "this is a female text," and becomes a powerful mantra. And I was struck by that moment when you're driving to Kilcrea and a former Taoiseach has died. And you turn off the radio, dismissing that whole hoo-ha as the fond caramel nostalgia of men.
A great man, a great man. Yeah.
Are you an angry woman?
Am I an angry woman? At times I'm an angry woman. I feel very close to history and to Irish history, and I'm fascinated by it and fascinated by the personalities that have driven it and their own strengths and fallibilities. So at moments like that where you're driven to consider someone who has contributed so much of their life to the development of the country, to consider them, their achievements and what they have given to us, I find that really interesting, how you can weigh a life. And I suppose that moment of the story was less about rejecting that man who I'd have admiration for, and more about choosing to listen to the three voices that remained in the car, which were mine, my daughter's, and the GPS, which was a female voice too.
Right. But of course, when you went down to Doireann, the woman's room was airbrushed out of it, and Daniel O'Connell was centre stage.
It was very interesting. Recently I was speaking to Olivia O'Leary about this, and she would have great knowledge of Daniel O'Connell's history at Doireann, and it was so interesting to speak to her about that sense of how strongly his history is represented within Doireann, so beautifully in fact, and his work so deeply honoured, and yet the women that would have lived their lives in those buildings as well were kind of put to one side. And the choices that we make, I suppose, in terms of which histories we choose to write and to tell, and which histories are gently pushed aside. I find that very interesting. It's not necessarily always a source of anger for me, to be honest. Sometimes it's just a great source of curiosity, and it makes me want to push aside the curtains and see who's standing behind them.
And you both write with a beautiful intimacy about your marriages.
I'll let you feed that one.
Yeah, because...
And music, of course, plays a huge part in your home.
Yeah, so I have an essay about singing in the book, because singing is a great source of kind of emotional expression for me, and I kind of really, me and my wife Anna, who's also a writer, Anna Carey, we sing a lot, and we were friends, and we kind of fell in love in the process of being in a band and singing together. And I was writing about my life, so even though I wasn't kind of explicitly ever writing about our relationship, it obviously kind of comes in a lot. And that's a strange thing too, when you're writing memoir, you're writing about other people, and you're conscious, like kind of like how certain stories are told. Like you're conscious that, you know, you've got the privilege of telling this story now, and this is from your perspective. And it's also amazing when you show it to other people who were there, and they kind of go, "That's not what happened." And I do take all that on board. Like nothing significant. It's often like mad details that you remember wrong, like someone being in the room, and they go, "That's the year they were in America." You're like,
but your best friend Corn Craig thought, you know, let's read a memoir by Napoleon or Julius Caesar, not Patrick Freyne.
He didn't say it like that. He said it. He was much more. He was nicer in his tone. He was like trying to help me out. He rang me. I sent him a few of the essays, and he rang me. I was out for a walk, and he goes, "I'm not sure who this is for. Like, I don't know, should this be for your therapist? Like, it doesn't feel like it should be, you know, a book. Like, if I wanted to read about someone's life, I'd read about Napoleon or Julius Caesar." And I had to explain to him, like, that I had to explain to him that memoirs exist and not famous people write memoirs. And then I said, and 20-somethings write memoirs. And he was like, really? That sounds really stupid. And I was, yeah. So I did show it to people who were in things. Actually, one interesting thing about Corncrick is he had no issues with anything I wrote about him, except he said at one point, I don't curse. Because I put the F word in his mouth in one remembered sentence. And he went, and I had to go, he doesn't curse, that's right.
Has it been removed?
It was removed. I changed it to feck.
And how did you structure, I mean, you had a poem and, you know, you speak of your being a devoted servant to this work and to Eileen Ní Ghríofa. It is extraordinary, isn't it, Doireann, that her grave is unknown?
It is extraordinary, but you know, as time went on, as I was going through the detective work and chasing the ghost of Eileen Dubh, the further I delved into her life, the more I came to accept the fact that, look, some parts of it are just shrouded in mystery. To begin with, I was really angered by the fact that we don't know where she's buried, but as time went on, I came to accept it. And I hope very much that, I mean, we say in Irish, Kirkluck le Carn, and I feel that I have been adding a stone to the little pile of stones of respect. So many people have attended to the Queen, translated the Queen, and so many people have honoured the Queen in their own artistic work. And I feel like this is my effort to add to that beautiful pile of stones that's already been put against her memory. And I'm really looking forward to who will come afterwards and all the other stones that will be subsequently added. And I hope those people will find out more and maybe they'll find her grave.
Right. And the piece you've chosen to read is also about something unknown, the name of Arthur Lear's horse.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is extraordinary that it is buried. Well, perhaps you'd read the piece.
I will. So Arthur Lear was involved during the era of the penal laws in a feud with a man of great power who used to be one of the sheriffs of Cork, Abraham Morris, and he offered him, for this beautiful horse he had been given by the European empress in whose army he had served, he offered him the paltry sum of £5, which was legal at the time. No Catholic was allowed to hold a horse of a value more than £5, and he refused it, and a feud began, and there was a price put on Art's head. And at the point where we meet the story here, Art is lying on the ground, having been ambushed and shot by Abraham Morris's men, and he is very unfortunately dying, and we follow the horse to see what will happen. The horse who is galloping through our thoughts now is a female being, conceived, born and reared in Europe. Look, the stable is dawn dark and straw hush, and through this gloom we watch her birth, swimming hoof first from the warm ocean of her mother's body. Little footling, her hooflets are waves, dashing wildly against the earth, amazed. The foal grows before our eyes. She thrives. With her first gallop, she gives herself to the bliss of speed and the rush of the breeze. She is of solid stock, as bright and as quick as any of her foremothers. Through each generation of her family, a human voice has echoed the same words in a series of tongues. Good girl, good girl. She is soon sold from her mother's presence. Never again will she meet those dark eyes. Instead, she comes to know the crisp straw of cavalry stables, the swish and clang of swords, the tang of muskets. No matter how many times the Queen galloped from mouth to mouth, no matter how many academic works respond to it, one detail is always missing. We never learn this horse's name. I can't bring myself to invent one. Instead, I honour her among the unnamed, a further absence among all the other female absences that are missing from this tale. I want you to know that she was a female being. I want you to know that she was a female being. I want you to know that she was.
And that has all the beautiful rhythm of poetry.
A lot of the passages of prose in this book are poems in disguise, which I'm sure you've noticed.
Well, I said earlier, Wordsworth says there's no difference between good prose and good poetry.
That's interesting.
And now for something completely different. We're with Mr. Patrick Freyne, high over, is it the Curragh?
Yeah,
Yes,
Thousand.
this
Well,
is
it's
Patrick
actually
Freyne.
over Nace, around Nace, I think.
Were you ever credited in the Braveheart?
No, I don't
No.
think so. Yeah, I was just a dog's body on the set of Braveheart. But around that time, for reasons that I still don't understand, I decided to do a parachute jump for charity. So this is a part of an essay about that. There's a few pieces in the book that kind of quite seriously delve into bereavement and death. This is one that I realized in retrospect is obviously linked, but it's a bit, it's just about a parachute jump, really. So I'm on a plane with a parachute instructor called Steve and a guy I've just met called Carl. Let me tell you how to jump from a small plane. First, you reach out of the plane, above the tremendous void of air that falls for thousands of feet beneath you, and you grab with your right hand the beam that runs diagonally from the base of the plane up to the wing. Then you step onto the step below the door, your right hand still grasping the beam, and you grab another bit of the beam with your other hand. Then, despite millions of years of evolution, during which we did not grow wings, you step off the aforementioned step and hang by the arms from the beam, your legs flapping in the air, very, very high above your mortal enemy, the ground. Then Steve counts to 3, and if you're Carl, you do not let go, and you continue to hang there with a panicked expression on your face. Let go, said Steve. I've changed my mind, said Carl. No, that's wrong. I'm getting the tone wrong. Let me try again. It was more like, I've changed my mind, screamed Carl, screamingly from his screaming face. You can't change your mind, said Steve. I want to get back in, screamed Carl, hanging from the wing of a plane 5,000 feet above the ground. I can't let you back in, said Steve. It's too dangerous. Ah, said Carl. Sorry, Carl, I can't let you back in, said Steve firmly, as though talking to a toddler whom he was forcing to jump from a plane. Ah, said Carl. Here's something important I learned from my time with Carl. There's only so much time you can be hanging for dear life to the wing of a plane before you lose strength and have to let go. In Carl's case, it was about 2 minutes. Then he lost his grip and plunged to what to him must have seemed like imminent death, but was really just a sensation of imminent death that humans flirt with because we have no natural predators and have evolved into something ridiculous. Anyway, that exchange between Steve and the plane and Carl hanging from the wing of the plane is still the most interesting conversation I have ever witnessed. I've not seen or heard anything like it to this day, and I've done acid. Then, as Carl fell to his possible death, Steve turned to me, calm as you like, and said, your turn.
Thank you for bringing us up on that plane. We're right there with you. How did you structure the book in that? You know, after that essay, you come upon something like you're not having children or mental health issues. Was it hard to get the 16 into a kind of a shape that, you know, was varied?
It took a while. It really reminded me of when I was in bands and you come up with a set list or an album list. And just like when you're in a band, you go, like, I think we need a slow song. And I'd have to go, like, I'd feel gaps in the story, and I would go write essays to fill the gap sometimes. And there is a tonal, I hope I got the tonal stuff right, because there are stories in this that are quite serious and go quite deep into things I've been feeling and things I've gone through. And then there are stories where the starting point was I just want to make people laugh. And the end point for all of them was I wanted stuff to be either entertaining or helpful or both to the reader. So I cut stuff that I felt was like self-indulgent or didn't help anyone to read it. Like you can write about your pain till the cows come home, but it's not always worth reading, you know. So when I was kind of structuring it, I did think a lot about, you know, where you put a serious essay, where you put a funny story. Like some essays have very serious points and funny bits within them. And other essays seem like funny romps, and then when you think about them, there's actually something quite dark undercurrent.
And that wonderful essay about being a carer for a year, and how you say that, you know, embarrassment doesn't figure in the life of a carer. That was really a powerful
Well, it was a revelation to me at that time. Like now it seems obvious to me, and I think any parent would know it. Like, I kind of stopped worrying about being embarrassed because you have to do things in public with people you're looking after that on paper look embarrassing, but aren't really embarrassing. And the things I found difficult when I was a care worker, and I was only a care worker for a year and a bit, you know, but it was a huge revelation to me about what it means to look after somebody, how work is valued, how some things, for no apparent reason, in my view, are esteemed really highly by society, and how other types of work aren't. And yeah, and I learned a lot about myself in that job, things I had to reckon with, shortcomings I had, ways I saw myself that just don't match up when you're out of your comfort zone, and something like that.
To end with questions from our audience in cyberspace, and one for you, Doireann, from a chap called Rob McManus. What did you learn from your experience of writing a memoir with an historical element?
I wouldn't call it a memoir.
Okay. Is it a novel?
I would just call it a book.
Okay. But it's not a novel.
No, I wouldn't
Though
call it a novel
there are imagined
either.
moments in it.
Yeah, there are. It's funny, you know, it feels very true to my experience of life. Whenever people ask me, well, what category would you put this book in, or which shelf in the library does it belong on? I kind of feel like I'd find it very difficult to pick a single genre from my own life as well. Like, I don't think it's a rom-com or a tragedy. It has elements of several different things. So I feel like in writing this book, I didn't have any feeling that I was writing into a particular genre. If anything, I felt I was writing against genre. And so I can't answer the memoir part of it, but I can say that it was very thrilling to try and veer very close to history in my writing, particularly as I'm someone who has never been trained as a historian, and I'm someone who gets a real electric thrill from trying things that I've never learned in college or in an evening class or anything, just giving something a go. So I really enjoyed learning about doing historical research and then writing about it in a way that tried to bring the reader along with me rather than keeping the reader at arm's length.
And a final question for you, Patrick. John Reynolds asks, why did you decide to take up writing?
I'm not sure. I think I always read, and I always had a notion that I would write. And then I was talking to you about this outside as well. I kind of like the idea of doing lots of different types of artistic things. So I was in a band for ages, and when we were in the band, we would write stuff too, and we'd throw them into little fanzines and things. So writing, like, I don't think there was a point when I said I'd become a writer. I think it kind of slowly crept up on me because I was doing little bits of it here and there. And then I was a journalist by profession. And I didn't call myself a writer then, but people started calling me a writer. And I figured, if they're calling me a writer, then so.
Well, writer you certainly are, as is Doireann Ní Ghríofa. Congratulations to you both on these two really, really wonderful books. And thanks very much.
Thank you.